Hello and welcome to the Controversies in Church History podcast. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. This is a reminder that you can find controversies in church history on various social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, this is a free podcast for most people. I try to make it available through as many platforms and different types of social media as I can, but I do actually try to advertise every once in a while. I do have a few expenses for doing this, and it is a lot of work. So this is supposed to be a service. You're not supposed to you don't have to do this, but if you'd like to become a patron of our podcast, go to patreon.com and you'll find our Patreon page on Patreon, where you can become a donor, a monthly donor. I think it's $5, $7, and $10 to help out defray some of the cost of this stuff. Going forward, I'm going to start doing more things, interviews of those sorts of nature for patrons on Patreon, to focus more on that. So if you want to keep supporting the podcast, keep it going. All the episodes, in terms of the archive of what I've done, will be available free. Eventually they'll be made after a month or so, all the new ones. But if you become a patron, you get new episodes a month in advance. You get some other things, bonus features that it won't make available. All the regular episodes will be available to all people. So just to help out and say thank you to some of my donors. So if you'd like to do that, please go to patreon.com and think about signing up. Thank you and God bless. Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast, which takes you through the most interesting, important, and controversial episodes in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Welcome again to all our listeners. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all our patrons on Patreon. If you want to follow us on social media, you can follow Controversies in Church History on Facebook, on Twitter, is it X, whatever, X, Twitter, you know what I mean. And then also, as I mentioned before, on Patreon, I also have a website, churchcontroversy.com, a link to other things that I do, excuse me, articles that I've written elsewhere, so you can find more content there as well. Excuse me. If you'd like to become a patron and get some bonus content, or early access to episodes, you can go to our Patreon account, which is also called Controversies in Church History. Welcome to our second episode of the new year, 2024. And for this episode's a little standalone one, which is it was going to be what we read in 2023. It's called What We've Been Reading 2023 and early 2024, because I didn't get the chance to read a few things. I was almost done. So I did this podcast last year. People kind of liked it, so all it is basically going to be going through some of the things that I've read the past year, most of which have something of an historical purpose to them, others not. I've been reading different things lately, so in any event, excuse me, some of them are historical. I'll go through those in more detail, but without further ado, what we've been reading for the past year or so, and in no particular order, I'll start with the first one on my list of 10 books. The first one's called The Hind and the Panther by John Dryden. If you don't know who John Dryden was, he was a poet, English poet, lived from 1631 to 1700, during the period usually known as the Restoration in England, 1660 roughly to 1688. Was a dramatist on the stage, composed original plays, but also updated versions of Shakespeare that were very popular at the time, as well as a translator, very famous as a translator at the end of his life. Early in his life, he was a member of the Church of England and a royalist, that is, he did a defender of the crown, especially their political conflicts at the end of the reign of Charles VI in the 1680s. He wrote poems in defense of him. He wrote a satirical poem called Absalom and Achitophel, trying to satirize the parliamentary opponents of the king. When Charles II died in 1685, his Catholic brother James became the King of England, and Dryden shortly thereafter came into communion with Rome. And The Hind and the Panther is the result of this. It's published in 1687, and it's a long fable. It's about 70 pages in the edition that I have. Meant to distinguish the Church of Rome as the true church in opposition to the Church of England. The hind in the title is the Catholic. Hind means deer, because innocent is a deer, right? And the Panther is the Church of England. And it makes fairly standard arguments against for the Catholic Church against Protestant claims, about need for authority, divisions amongst Protestants, the need for tradition. And it's kind of interesting. It ends without really any agreement between the Hind and the Panther. And if you don't, again, get the background of this, one of the things James did as a Catholic monarch was try to grant religious toleration for those groups outside the official Church of England, this Catholics, but he also issued a declaration of indulgence giving religious toleration to those Protestant groups that weren't part of the Church of England. And this really upset the Church of England, and the crown was kind of supported by the Church of England. That's what led to his downfall, actually, if you don't know, in 1688. People were so stressed by this and upset by this, they, eventually basically committed a coup d'etat and got rid of him. But it's kind of difficult to discern. The editor of my edition says this. It's hard to see the exact purpose of the poem because there's no agreement between the Panther and the Hind by the end of it. It's kind of interesting. Dryden was a very renowned poet. He's one of the originators of what's sometimes called the Augustan age of British poetry, where the majority of it is written in these rhymed Alexandrian couplets, and they're kind of this, it's this very almost kind of prose-like poetry. If you know who Alexander Pope is, for example, someone like that from the 18th century, Dryden knew, actually, I think. Memory serves. It's kind of this, it's almost like rhymed prose. To me, is in terms of poetic endeavor, it's a drop off from the eras of Shakespeare or John Donne or people like this. But he's a fine wordsmith. Was Dryden. I've been reading more about him, partly because my background is in that period as an historian. But he does have a gift for memorable phrases. There's one passage in the poem where he's defending the idea of the real presence, saying that Protestants don't take the Bible literally enough. I think this passes in John 66:53, where John, this, eat my flesh and drink my blood. That's the literal, thing that Jesus says. And in response to criticisms in the poem, he writes this little couplet. Well, it's multiple couplets. There's one little couplet. He says, quote, "The literal sense is hard to flesh and blood, but nonsense never can be understood," unquote. So kind of an interesting poem, more for historical reasons. Dryden was an interesting figure. He wasn't really, one of the things he talks about in that poem is he's trying to argue against the Church of England persecuting the Catholic Church. He was also, by the way, against the persecution of Protestants in France by the Catholic king, Louis XIV, and it made him kind of an outsider. Dryden was kind of a lone figure in some ways in his time. He was an interesting figure, interesting writer, and so I've been trying to read more poetry lately, and Dryden kind of appeals to me for those reasons. So that's The Hind and the Panther. I don't necessarily recommend it, except as a historical, if you want to get that sense of that brief period where there was a Catholic king of England and what was going on. You get a little bit of the sense of it from this, but it's mostly sort of an oddity. I've been trying to do more, read more poetry that way. So was the first book on my list. The second book, much different, much different, is a book of philosophy. I think I'm going to butcher this name, by a Korean philosopher who was born in Germany. I guess he's of German extraction, writes in German, and it's called "The Disappearance of Rituals: A Topology of the Present" by Byung Chul-Han. And it came out in 2019 in English. And he writes in German, and he's kind of if you know what the term is, post-structuralist or postmodern is the term, you probably less precise term, in terms of the allegiances of the way he writes, which is kind of interesting. And I came to this book because it's about in this book he's contrasting present contemporary society against what he's calling a ritual society. He means pre-modern societies mostly. And I came to this book primarily from a book review by Joseph Shaw. Joseph Shaw is the chairman of the Latin Mass Society of the UK. He's also the head of the international organization Una Voce, which is the promoter of the traditional Latin Mass. And very intelligent guy. If you haven't read any of his stuff, you should, especially if you're coming from a non-traditionalist background and listening to this. Good entry. He's very Eirenic. He's very... it's not a lot of shouting and screaming coming from Joseph Shaw. If you're a traditionalist, you don't know who he is, you should definitely read his stuff. He has a blog, Chairman's blog. He's written a few books. Anyway, he had good things to say about it. I don't know if I was as impressed with it. It has said some interesting things. I mean, the biggest argument of the book is that, what the title says, that basically contemporary society has been de-ritualized, that it's gone from being a society of ritual. He calls them ritual societies, in which there's no distinction between the inner person and outer society. The individual human beings disappear within these rituals. They become part of a community. And he connects this, by the way, this lack of ritual with lack of community, with lack of meaning, those sorts of things. Compares that to the present day society, which is in contrast with ritual, in which a person can sort of lose themselves, right? You become part of the gesture and the patterns that rituals make up, in contrast to what our contemporary society, which is one of authenticity. He contrasts that, and he thinks very, very, he's very much against this idea of authenticity. He makes the point, and this is one of the things Shaw had to say about it, he thought was good, is that people tend to look down on earlier societies, pre-modern societies, that are based on these arcane, difficult to understand rituals, as people not being somehow insincere or not true to their real individual selves, because they don't seem to have any sort of individual self in the same way we understand it. And what Chul-Han says is it's the opposite, that the distinction between inner and outer man comes from contemporary society, where people are on the internet and on social media trying to pretend they're people who they're not 24/7. And it's a good insight. There's some good insights in here, and it's worth reading for that alone. It's a very short book, by the way. It's only about 90 pages. Dense, though. He's talking about things like, community, play as opposed to work, attitudes toward death and how they're shaped by all this stuff. And it's interesting and definitely worth a read. It has obvious problems. He calls them a postmodernist, but he does write in these very big overgeneralizations. Some of the historical arguments he makes in this book are deeply flawed. Deeply flawed, I'll put it that way. I'll leave it at that. So it has problems in it. I mean, one of the things, and this is something, again, Shaw mentioned, I'll mention it here, is that, again, this distinction he's drawing, in some senses is correct. In other senses, it sounds a little off to me. In fact, his understanding of how, he seems to denigrate individuality so much. It sounds kind of East Asian, which is, given his background, makes sense. You can find, and again, Shaw mentions this in his review, which was on, by the way, if you want to look at that, it's on the European Conservatives website. So European Conservatives, a magazine, they publish print and online, but he mentions, because one of the things that's, the idea that there's no distinction between, there's no, because one of the things Chul-Han says, there's no problem of insincerity in a ritual society because you just become the rituals. Well, the ancient, the prophets, the Hebrew prophets kind of, they're, a data point against that. I mean, they're criticizing rituals and stuff like this in their books. And so, again, don't always line up with them, but it's some interesting stuff in there. Says some interesting things about the lack of ritual and community in the contemporary world, which I've had ritual on the brain this year a lot, partly because I've been doing stuff, Latin Mass stuff. We'll get into a moment. I read, well, you'll see in a moment, this is one of the highlights for you here. If you want this stuff, the best book, probably the best book for anybody to understand the old Latin Mass, because of what's going on currently in the church. So, but also I've been reading stuff on ritual more generally speaking, and it's fascinating. Just ritual as a natural part of human society. It does seem like something we need, and getting rid of it seems like a really bad thing. And I think where I probably disagree with him a little bit is that I don't think rituals have disappeared so much as that they've been degraded. We have these deracinated, we have pathetic rituals. I'll put it that way. Pathetic means they have some of the same characteristics as a ritual, right? They're ceremonial, they're repetitive, but they're so they're so, you feel like, thinned out, right? Sometimes anthropologists make a distinction between, thick cultures and thin ones. Thick cultures are ones that they have really detailed rituals. They're very, bound by these things. They have lots of boundaries and stuff. Thin cultures, usually thinking of modern ones, they don't have less of that stuff. That's our problem, is that they've been emaciated. We're probably, I would say, we live in a ritual starved society, and we need deeper and better rituals. That's why some people find attraction to the old Latin Mass. It's really, it's heavy stuff. And again, a contrast would be with newer Mass. It doesn't make as many demands on the person, so you have less to invest in, and therefore less to get out of it, I guess, in some regards. But book worth mentioning because of its brevity and worth reading, even if those are some things in there that, don't quite, I don't think, add up. So that's number 2 on our list. Number 3 on our list, really enjoyed this one. Excuse me. And it's a biography by Julian Jackson of Charles de Gaulle, A Certain Idea of France, The Life of Charles de Gaulle. It's published in 2018. Jackson, from what I gather, is the premier, at least one of them, scholars of Charles de Gaulle in English. Charles de Gaulle, if you don't know who he was, probably the major figure in 20th century French politics. He was a general in the first, well, he was a soldier and officer in the First World War, general in the interwar period, and became famous because he refused to surrender when the Nazis conquered France. He basically escaped to Britain, started broadcasting over radio, became part of the resistance movement, got in contact. He became basically the symbol of French resistance during World War II. After the war, he became president twice. Once immediately after the war, and then late in the 1950s, he came into power again. And you cannot understand modern France without de Gaulle. He's a hugely important figure. Also has, of course, ties to Catholicism. He born in a French Catholic middle-class family, rose to the army. And Jackson's biography does a really good job doing all of this. Gives you his personality, really good on his personality, who he was. Takes you to the heights of his power and in the post-war era, and shows you how de Gaulle shaped the nature of the French state for many years. I mean, he really does. Even today, things have changed, and they're changing a lot right now in France. But what he shows to me out of this was that de Gaulle is a man of great political skill. Very, very sharp. Even though he's a fairly traditional guy in some regards, he did not really want to repudiate modernity, especially in terms of things like technology and those sorts of things. He modernized France in many ways in that regard when he was president. But his abiding passion is in the title of the book, A Certain Idea of France. De Gaulle is a French patriot above all things, probably. Is a fascinating, to me, comes off as a fascinating, in his book, a fascinating combination of patriotism, almost sort of mystical nationalism. He has a mystical belief in the greatness of France. But also he's quite frankly an opportunist. When he sees an opportunity, he will sacrifice, you could say, larger principles. Not that one, never the nation itself, but he can be opportunistic in a way that, may not scandalize Anglophone people. I don't know. But also his just wonderful. I don't think I could stand the guy in person, but reading about him, his sort of overweening Gallic pride is just kind of astonishing to behold. And Julian Jackson is very good. I mean, he describes his faults, and he does have many. But the thing I got from it, his faults just seem to make his greatness more evident. He really was a towering figure in European politics. And he's probably the only really, I don't know how to put this, nationalist/traditionalist figure on the European right in the post-war, since World War II, to have had electoral success. To have become, president of a country or something like that. And you had, after World War II, you had a couple of what amounted to dictators in terms of Francisco Franco in Spain and Antonio Salazar in Portugal. But really, everyone on the right in Europe who wins elections, kind of more like, say, Margaret Thatcher, or in America, Ronald Reagan. They're more like free marketers more than anything else. They're not really
it may be in their platform, but they're not really in anything like traditional ideas about the nation, or to a lesser extent, Gaulle was a Catholic. He was a believing Catholic. He's interesting, though. I mean, he was an interesting figure. I actually did a little bonus episode for patrons only on my Patreon account. If you want to go listen to that, I'll talk a little more about that. But has interesting things to say about the church in that biography, as reported by Jackson. Highly recommend it. Wonderful, but very long book, big book, but a wonderful biography if you like that sort of thing, which I highly recommend to our listeners. That's number 3. Number 4 on the list, more poetry. The second book I've read other poets, but not full books of poetry. One book of poetry I finished was Songs of Innocence and Experience by William Blake. If you don't know who William Blake is, a famous English poet of the late 18th century. One of the first English romantic poets for whom feeling took precedence over things like reason and rationality. This is, poetry was, again, I mentioned Dryden earlier, just to go back. Poetry was this very formalized thing prior to the coming of the Romantics in English. And what the Romantics did was make it a lot more informal. His contemporary, William Wordsworth, wrote in his preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1798, excuse me, that real poetry was not elegant rhymed verse like you have in Dryden, but, quote, powerful emotions recollected in tranquility, unquote, in a language of, quote, men speaking to other men, unquote. Not in this highfalutin, high-sounding diction that's artificial. It's a reaction against artificiality. And Blake's a part of that. Blake's all about sincerity. Sincerity is one of the big things that remember. Be sincere to who you are, right? We were talking about authenticity just a moment ago with Byung Chul-Han's book. This is kind of the beginnings of this stuff. And if you don't know, Blake's poems were published in 1794, the Songs of Innocence and Experience. It's a bunch of short lyric poems, which are, in my edition, I have a real nice collectible edition. Reproduced alongside the text are actually his watercolor paintings, which he put in on the opposing page in the book. Really lovely. Like, he's a very artistic guy, obviously, Blake was. And the first part of the book is called Songs of Innocence, where he celebrates human innocence. He celebrates children. This is a very romantic thing. And then the second part, Songs of Experience, not necessarily a mourning of loss of innocence, but more about mourning things like the injustice. This is a big thing with Romanticism, like the injustice of men justice of man toward humanity or for his fellow man, that sort of thing, where he will talk about his hatred of exploitation, whether by landowners or the church or the state. This usually means the Church of England in his mind. I believe he died a member of the Church of England or not. I haven't looked it up. Read Blake in a long time, read about him, but he was a Christian of sorts, though not entirely orthodox, even according to the standards of the Church of England at his time. But you will always get something. It's something real. It's definitely him. It's definitely something authentic, if you want to use that modern phrase for it. Some of the poems are quite lovely, talking about childlike innocence and how that reflects the image of God and things of this nature. And then others are kind of more activist. They sound like an obnoxious 21st century activist a little bit. Others less persuasive, but they do all intimate a sincere desire to find the image of God in one's fellow man. And however misguided, they're compelling. Make for interesting reading to a certain degree. So if you want to, expand your horizons, read some poetry, you can do worse than reading into Blake. That was number 4 on our list. Number 5, this is one of the historical books. The first history on this list. Well, I guess the biography was kind of one, but this is a book. I've been reading this for a book I'm writing, actually, which won't tell you what it is yet, but it's by Carlos Eire, called War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin, which was published back in 1986. And Eire, if you don't know, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, it's Eire. Carlos Eire is one of the actual major living historians of the Protestant Reformation and is a professor of history up at Yale University in Connecticut. And he is also authored, by the way, of one of the best general histories on the Reformation era called Reformations. And Eire is a Cuban. He's from Cuba. He wrote a memoir about growing up in that country, which was well received by critics, called Waiting for Snow in Havana. He's also a practicing Catholic, and I think, again, it's hard to tell. Scholars don't want to jump into this stuff, especially in the ones in the academy. Everything I've heard sounds pretty orthodox. So he's not, again, I have to make these distinctions when I talk about this stuff, but he sounds pretty much like that. I think maybe a little more so than Eamon Duffy, who would be his counterpart on across the pond. Duffy's made noises about things like women's ordinations over the years. That's why I say that. But Eire sounds like a fairly straightforward guy. And his book, War Against the Idol, is a history of, really, it's a history of iconoclasm in the early years of the Reformation up to the end of the 16th century, roughly. It's not really, it's chronological, but it goes through all the major thinkers of the Reformation. And so it's a synthetic history. It's not, it combines analysis of the major texts by people like Luther and Heinrich Bullinger and people like that. And actually starts, by the way, before the Reformation, because there are critics of Catholic worship among humanists like Erasmus and the Frenchman, you might know this, is Lefebvre de Table in France before the Reformation, who kind of contributed to this critique of things like the veneration of images and how that feeds into later reformers' critiques like Luther and Bullinger and people like that. Above all, John Calvin, because he is the one who, in this book, takes center stage. Excuse me. But also a history of the actual iconoclastic movements that take place, because in every place where the Reformation has any sort of popular support, you have what amount to activists who go around demanding first that the public authorities remove images from churches. They don't do this. They begin to either sort of demonstrate and threaten the authorities. This is the way it happened in Switzerland, for example. He spends a lot of time talking about Switzerland, where the Reformed tradition begins, well before Calvin. People like Huldrych Zwingli in the 1520s and the 1530s, Heinrich Bullinger, begin it there, where you have popular iconoclasm. People just go into churches and start destroying images. And he... it's an excellent book. He makes clear that Protestant ideas lead to iconoclasm, but also makes clear that in practice, not all of the reformers drew those conclusions from these ideas. The big exception really is Luther. Luther never really agreed with his colleague Andreas Karlstadt in Wittenberg that icons and other material forms of worship were de facto idolatry. Again, Karlstadt and then later on the Reformed tradition more in particular, they thought worship should be as pure as possible, meaning pure as being more on the word, and any deviation, being the scripture, but also the preaching of it. And any deviation from that was, man-made tradition. It had to be gotten rid of. It was too big of a temptation. Luther thought that material things used for worship were kind of indifferent. And the issue for him wasn't the material things themselves, but people's attitudes toward them. That is to say, as long as one had total trust in God alone, you could still use worships, but not putting trust in the means of salvation, in other words. The Reformers had a very different idea. They saw things, whereas Luther's, worship seemed to be, at least the matter of use of physical things in worship was more a matter of subjective attitudes. They thought it was an objective thing, that there are objectively false and demonic forms of worship. And anything except the preaching of the Bible more or less amounted to that. But even so, it was really John Calvin who turns this condemnation of, by the way, condemnation, when I say condemnation, they're condemning Catholic worship, of course. But they can really condemn in many ways any sort of worship that puts emphasis on material things or like this really is John Calvin. And he will basically turn this idea, this iconoclasm, into a revolutionary ideology. That's really the burden of his book, by putting idolatrous worship at the center of his theology, meaning that whereas for Luther, the main idea was justification by faith alone. As long as you put your trust in God alone and not in your own works, you're okay. For Calvin, idolatry was the original sin of a fallen humanity. And because mankind was so corrupted in his mind, idolatry is inevitable. On the other hand, he thought there could be no compromise with idolatrous forms of worship because they necessarily corrupted and destroyed the whole community. He thought of idolatry as being like a contagion, that if you didn't cut it out at the root, would kill it would turn you into papist again, basically. So Calvin has a real severe attitude toward it. He did not actually encourage his followers to destroy images themselves. Instead, he thought it was the role of the state to do this. However, the relentlessness of his logic, in arguing for this, but also the violence of he has very violent rhetoric. It's very incendiary. Was taken by his later followers, especially in France, and made even more radicalized, where the Reformed the Huguenots, the Reformed Protestants there were a beleaguered minority in a Catholic state where you have Catholic worship and all these Catholic rituals. These Huguenot writers were going around saying that this was all idolatry and stuff, and this is why it gets so bitter and violent in the French wars of religion there. And in fact, what happens is the Huguenot writers and activists, when confronted by this, because they're going around, getting rid of images and calling them idol worship. The Catholic monarchy in France came to see these Protestants as seditious and rebellious. And so in time, the Reform authors there began to argue for resistance to the monarchy, violent resistance, on the basis of the idea that if kings supported idolatry, they forfeited their right to obedience. It was that important. And they took it farther than, because, by the way, Calvin didn't go that far. They took his ideas and extrapolated from them. And by the way, this idea would actually find echoes in Catholic circles during the wars of the religion in France as well. So it had this effect of, bleeding into all confessions, this idea that idolatry was the worst thing that justified really extreme measures because of the logic of all this. A really fascinating book. Again, it's very academic. This is an academic work. So if you're not used to doing this, it's probably not going to be, might be too much for you. I can't think of a popular version of this that might do it. But it's, as far as I can tell, still the standard academic treatment of the subject 40 or so years on, or almost 40 years on. And still, for me, makes compelling reading. And by the way, I should mention as well, he is thinking of his own experience in this, Eire, because he talks about, he alludes to this in the introduction or the preface. He grew up in Cuba, had to leave because of the Cuban Revolution there, and he talks about that. It did affect him. He's thinking about this in revolutionary terms because of that. So, fascinating book, highly recommended. And for the fifth book on our list, sixth book, it was the fifth book. I misspoke. Number 6 on our list is by a friend of mine I have not met, but I'm friendly with him, Father Robert McTeigue. Father McTeigue. Of the Society of Jesus, Christendom Lost and Found, Meditations for a Post-Christian World. And this is a small book by Father McTeigue, who I've had the pleasure of being interviewed by many times on his radio program. Highly recommend it. He's very good. Go listen to it. It's very good. I think it's the Catholic Current. Really good interviewer, asks great questions, very lively mind. Anyway, this began as a journal in 2019, kind of turned into this book, a journal of the COVID lockdowns in 2020. And what it is basically is a sustained meditation on the nature of what he, in the title of the book is Meditations for a Post-Christian World. And that's what it is. He's trying to navigate his way through what we're going through now. A series of reflections, some a few sentences long, some several pages long, particularly centered around the idea of Christendom, that ruminate on this idea, what it means for Catholics and Christians going forward in this rapidly changing world. And, excuse me, Father McTeigue counsels against the sort of unthinking adherence to the glories of the past, as Pope Francis would put it, of old Christendom, without, however, giving into the temptation to refuse to see what was good and enduring in those centuries when Christianity was synonymous with society. Because that's, of course, the thing we're almost still dealing with, isn't it? Christianity, at one point, there was no such thing as society. Everything was kind of the church. All you have to do is, if you've ever taken a trip to Europe, just walk into any old town, kind of church in the middle of it. There is no society. Or the word society must have meant something. Societas in Latin must have meant something different, because there's no body separate from the state of the church. It's all kind of one thing. And we have been living with and trying to deal with the breaking apart of that for so long. He's trying to, in these little meditations, trying to recognize some of the games that might be had in our present situation, no matter how distressing, right? Because we all look back and see some things were kind of, some things, not everything at all, the church kind of got right under what we call Christendom. And we're bombarded 24/7 about the things they got wrong, and they did get some things wrong, our ancestors. But you see some things you'd almost like to recreate in a different way, and people have talked about this a lot more, in a more sophisticated way than I can. One of the things I like about his book is he does not provide really a set of answers to the problem that the church faces today in terms of how to recover all those good things in Christendom and how to go forward from this. But he sets it up as a series of questions, individual questions that both individual Catholics and the church itself needs to ask itself in order for the church to be able to do that, in order to survive and pass on the gift of faith in Jesus Christ and of his saving grace and love to people. Because that's, of course, the hard thing we have to do. Things have become so fragmented, so complicated. How do we usually look back to, Christendom as a time of lost unity, and how can you recover that unity in a fragmented world? And again, his book is good for having some humility, but also asking pointed questions, as he is wont to do. So I do recommend my friend Father Robert McTeige's book, Christendom Lost and Found. I find it interesting and kind of, it's a little bit challenging at first. I was kind of like, it's like, oh, I'm being questioned, but it was good. It was a good book. I recommend it. Please consider buying his book. It's worth the time and money. A very short book. That was number 6. Number 7, next two on the list, actually, I've been trying to, in my own mind, I'm an historian by training. I do history. I mentioned I've been doing writing projects. I've been writing novels, actually, and so I've been trying to read more fiction. And so the next two are novels. This one, number 7, was pretty good. It's by a Tunisian-born French author named Yamin Manai, Yamen Manai, Yamin Manai, The Ardent Swarm, from 2017. And this novel is something of an allegory for the impact of Islamic extremism on that country. In the book, there's a Tunisian village, and the main character is a beekeeper in the village who finds that his bees are being attacked and threatened with destruction, actually, by an alien species of hornet. And now, this alien species of hornet got into Tunisia, because it's actually native in Asia. This is part of the plot. It's native of Asia. It's not from the Middle East or from North Africa. Comes to North Africa via a ship that's brought there by the auspices of an Islamic political party, which during the course of the book takes power in Tunisia. And they come into the village and they begin sort of, handing out, goods and stuff to people and telling them to vote for the party and getting some of these people to become Islamic, militant types. And so there's a parallel between the party taking over the village and the bees coming and threatening the beehives of this beekeeper. And so in order to save his bees from destruction, the beekeeper has to go halfway across the world, actually, to find a particular type of queen bee to introduce into his hive so it can breed a different type of, introduce a strain into his bees where they teach them a technique to protect themselves from the hornets called the ardent swarm. I won't go through this much detail unless you can Google it or whatever, but kind of interesting. It's easy enough to read. It's pretty well written. There's one quotable quote in there. I can't put in here. There's a 4-letter word in it, but it was actually good. But kind of an allegory about the impact of Islamism on his country. Lives in France now, I think Paris, but clearly concerned with Tunisia. And the book works pretty well as a straightforward story, as a narrative. How much it works as a political allegory criticism, I'm not sure, but it was enjoyable. It's interesting. Had a theme. I like themes. And so I find that I've been reading a lot of fiction. Like most of the stuff I've been reading the last couple of years has been by male authors who are not American, like from other countries. That tends to be the best bet for me enjoying myself with a lot of these things. So I do recommend The Ardent Swarm if you want a readable novel that's a little more than just a good yarn. There's a little more there going on there in The Ardent Swarm. Number 8 Another novel. This one's a little less. There's a little less going on there. This is by Mike Yomer. It was published last year in 2023. Please Tell Me. And Mike Yomer's book is a crime thriller in which a young girl disappears from her parents' backyard one day, and after a frantic search, the people of the town, except for the mother, give up, presuming she's dead. However, the girl, beginning of the novel, 1 year later shows up, wandering the streets, unable to speak. And so she begins working with one of the main character of the book, who is a child therapist, who begins to try to unlock what's happened to her in the past year. And so she begins working with dolls, playing things out with dolls because she won't speak to them. But as she begins to work things out, what happened to her, because she was kept captive by this serial killer for a year, she discovers, the therapist does, that the little girl is actually playing out a series of grisly murders that haven't happened yet with her dolls, each of which actually does come to pass. So she has to work with a police detective to track down the murderer before he kills his final victim, which, as it turns out, will be someone very close to the therapist herself. This is more of a yarn. I just wanted something good to read. I like the premise of it. It was interesting. I do recommend it. Again, this is more beach reading. Like, this is just an easy read. Highly recommend it. I've been looking at things that are entertaining. It was a good novel. I think it's the Mike Yomer, his first novel. So welcome change of pace. I've been trying to read less heavy things lately. So Mike Yomer, Please Tell Me, if you like a good story. Number 9 on our list is another sort of academic work, very heavy but very interesting. Kind of goes with the theme of what I've been sort of researching lately. James Simpson, Under the Hammer, Iconoclasm in the Anglo-American Tradition, from 2010. James Simpson is a professor of literature. I don't know where. I didn't get his. I didn't know where. He's somewhere. I don't know where. Maybe one of the Ivies. I don't know. Might be Harvard. Anyway, he's written several well-received books on the Reformation, actually. One of his books was called Burning to Read, about how early Protestants read the Bible in 16th century England. And a book I'm also currently reading, called The Permanent Revolution, which is basically about the roots of modern liberalism in the Protestant Reformation. Excuse me. And so he's an interesting figure. And in this book, Under the Hammer, he basically is writing a history of how the iconoclasm in England between 1538 and 1643, during its Reformation period, shaped visual representation and beliefs about visual representation in art and poetry in the Anglo-American tradition up through the 20th century. And what he does is he looks at poetry and art, and both the modern world and moving back to and up through the Reformation to the 18th century, how Anglophone iconoclasm, and it's important, by the way, to his argument that he's making in academic terms, that it is state-sponsored iconoclasm in England. There had been people smashing statues before. This was the first time a government had done this as a matter of policy. And he says they do this partly because they need to erase the memory of the previous, not only the memory of the previous regime, the Ancien regime, the old church, but the actual jurisdiction of these previous political and religious authorities. And in doing so, they help create an official narrative of the past as one of idolatry that needs to be swept away by an elite, which is more pure, that worships, with the intellect only, but the pure word, the Bible, all that stuff. I'm being imprecise here, if I slow things down for you. And he actually says, and this is the burden of his argument, is that modern cultures need to break with its past, literally its iconoclasm, originates in this period, at least in the Anglo-American tradition. He also makes the argument that our modern sensibilities about art itself is actually iconoclastic and the product of earlier Protestant iconoclasm. As he puts it, the Anglo-American tradition, quote, insistently and violently repudiates idols and images as dangerous carriers of the old regime, unquote. You can kind of guess one of the reasons why I read this book. The past half decade and more have seen destruction of things like statues, removal of things like statues, because they are tainted with bad past regimes in American history. And this is a very, very good book if you want to understand where some of that stuff comes from, because this attitude toward the past that gets created in the early modern period in England, in the English-speaking world, gets transferred to the New World. And Simpson's really good at doing this. He's a literature professor, so it's not It's not your standard history. He's not going to delve into a lot of details. He takes a look at like works of art, analyzes them, gives his interpretation of them, as well as going over mostly poetry. So it's not a straightforward political argument, but it's fascinating for all this, and I highly, highly recommend it. Very important for what I'm doing in my little project I'm working on. And then finally, and this is probably the best thing from my audience, maybe the best book I read all year. I don't know. It might be, actually. Last one, number 10, Michael Fiedrowicz. I think I'm pronouncing that the right way. Fiedrowicz. 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 It's these Polish names. I can never pronounce them. The Traditional Mass, History, Form, and Theology of the Classical Roman Rite. Published in German in 2011. Published in English in 2021. And this is pretty much the book, the best single book on the historical, theological, spiritual aspects of the traditional Mass, the rite of the Roman Church prior to 1970. He divides the book into 3 parts. The first part gives you a brief history of the Roman Rite, how it changed over time from the earliest times in 1962. Second part talks about the structure of the Mass, the liturgical year. He calls it form, but all the basic forms of the Roman Rite. The direction of prayer, toward the east, liturgical Latin, as a chapter, and a chapter on ritual, which he not only defends the ceremonies of the old Mass, he also defends ritual in general as necessary to sacred worship. And then the final section deals with theology of the classical Roman Rite, examining the prayers of the old Mass in detail, giving you the theological content, what they mean. And I have to say, this is pretty much the only book you need. If you're going to get a book and learn about the old Mass, this is it. Again, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a little too academic for some people, but this was chef's kiss. This is the thing you've been looking for if you're looking for this. And really, I should stress, though, by the way, I think to understand the old Mass, and again, I'm someone who attends it, and I've attended other rites as well, it takes more than book learning, I think. I think you need to have some experience with the older rite to really understand it at a more than a deeper level to be able to experience it the right way. Some theological learning. It takes some doing. I won't go into this detail, make this any longer than it needs to, but I think maybe some experience. You do not, by the way, need to know Latin. There are plenty of wonderful missals and hand missals and booklets out there that translate the basic parts of the old rite into English. You can understand it just fine, follow along that way. So it takes some doing to understand the old Mass, what it's about, why. If you're just wondering, by the way, if someone who happens upon this, you don't like the old Mass, maybe you're wondering why are people be attracted to this would be a good place to start, because it's just hard to explain to people how different it is from the new one. I didn't understand it. It took me a long time. I've been to several. I've been maybe a half dozen times to the older rite before, and it took me years to understand. It's not an easy thing to grasp, given the sort of society we live in a lot of respects. But if you want to learn about the old Mass, study it. This is by far the best single book on this subject I have read. Highly recommend. Probably the best book I finished this past year. And that is it for our what we've been reading review the past year-ish for your proprietor of controversies in church history. Couple of things upcoming. Next episode should be out soon. It'll be a little Catholic Lives episode. A Catholic Lives episode is a short biography of essentially non-sainted, non-canonized Catholics from history. And the next one's going to be on Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the King of Jerusalem, who was the leper king. So some interesting stuff there. Should be fun. And then maybe another one of those actually, or I don't know, a couple of standalone episodes, and then that'll be probably get maybe one more at the end of the month, maybe 2 the next month. Don't know. And working on soon for my patrons, I am working on the next interview, which I hope you'll find interesting. It'll be weird for you, but it's definitely different. You will get your money's worth for it, I promise. But that's coming as well. I also want to remind people, look out for stuff I write in Crisis Magazine. I haven't published anything there in a while, but if you missed it, I published an article. Actually, it was over 2 articles that broke up into 2 on the the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. It was called Dostoevsky for Catholics. So he's a Russian Orthodox author. I highly recommend that if you want to learn more about him. Nothing upcoming. I have some things in the pipeline. Again, I've been doing, fiction writing lately. Hopefully get back to doing some more stuff, Catholic stuff for you as well. Keep a lookout on that. And again, if you want to follow us, please follow me on Facebook, Twitter. Go find me on churchcontroversies.com. Send me an email. By the way, send me feedback. I want to hear from you guys. If there's anything you want to hear, I might do this every episode. Derek, talk to your people. You're my people. Come send me emails, send me stuff. Let me know what you want to hear. I'm doing what I want to do, and I'll keep doing that. But if there's something else you want to know about, I'll try to do an episode, short one, long one, I don't know. I said before, I'm trying to make my episodes shorter. I say this as I complete a nearly 15-minute episode on what books I've been reading this year. But I'm trying to, because some of these episodes, they become just humongous work projects, and I just don't have time to get to them. But we'll be serving a need out there. People want it going forward, hopefully until I drop. But if you have anything you want me to look at, there are some things in the past. I'm getting to them as soon as I can. There will probably be, some stuff people have asked me about in the past. I'm getting there. If you asked a long time ago and you're still around, trust me, I'll get there eventually. And in fact, I think the next episode, when I get to the next episode in the Latinization series, that one will probably be in February. That will, one of my listeners, I'm getting there. I promise. I'm taking my time, but I do have other things to do. So in any event, thank you all for listening. Really wonderful that you do listen to this. Hope you got something out of it. Thank you to all our patrons out there. Really appreciate, it means a lot to me. It lets me know what I'm doing is worthwhile. So, but that is it for this time on Controversies in Church History. Have a great week, everyone. And you'll be hearing from me soon. Take care and God bless.